Okay, it's
Do I
connected.
sound good?
Ah, there we go. So yeah, it'll just start, but we can always edit and what have you. So yeah, I'm just trying to work out where we're going to put it so you know. I did some stuff with a group of people where I live, all to do with the COVID vaccine. So we managed to I actually got Senator Ron Johnson on board. So he chaired it. I got Andrew Bridgen, who's the UK MP. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's been really vocal in terms of what was going on. And I managed to get Ryan Cole, who I think is brilliant. So the pathologist, Ryan Cole, he spoke on it, and a couple of cardiologists. Oh, Peter McCullough as well. So I don't know your views on any of those, and to be honest, I don't have really strong views on them. Only that they were trying to help us bring information to our local governments about what was going on, because it's been deadly silent over here. Like no one's put their head up to basically say anything. So yeah, I've got that platform we can put this to as well. But I'm probably not going to do it in the name of the vaccine injured because that it all just gets very tricky when I'm obviously supporting vaccine injured people. And when it gets very political, people who are in that kind of realm, they shun it basically. But I've got my own reasons for doing this. So yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I feel like my story itself shouldn't be looked at as political. I mean, I got sucked into a operation of some sorts that we'll get into.
yeah,
But I'm very apolitical.
same,
I'm very, I'm
same,
calling me an anarchist, but like a good anarchist. I'm not here to like
same.
burn things. It's more
Me
like
too.
I just don't believe in the system. So,
Me too. Yeah, I feel exactly the same. I'm very much on the same page as where you're at, basically. I don't believe in, I think politics is a pantomime, basically. I don't think there's any free choice at all. And I don't see any point in the current system continuing as it is. So the only way that can change is if people have information, which is why I'm passionate about trying to get the real truth out there and not a watered down version that sort of is palatable for mainstream media. So yeah. So Justin Leslie, I'm just going to introduce you as the person who was the original Pfizer whistleblower. Um, and you did that sort of via Project Veritas initially, wasn't it? Yeah, okay. And so, yeah, going back, you went into university, studied, and you finished in 2020, was it?
I graduated the University of Rhode Island in 2020 with a degree in pharmaceutical and biomedical sciences. So I was like a bench level scientist right out of college, and I couldn't find a job. So I ultimately went back to school for a
Yeah.
master's program during the whole COVID scam. And I really started waking up when I was at Rutgers in my master's program. And the reason I went to Rutgers is because I have, I don't really even believe in disease labeling anymore. I ultimately just think it's pretty much you're poisoned in some way, shape, or form, and your body is showing symptoms of detox. But I was given this disease called tuberous sclerosis complex at the age of 10, which is ultimately linked to symptoms of autism, epilepsy, benign tumors throughout the body. I have like cracks in my nails. I supposedly have a tumor that's very, very small in my brain, like this small, like smaller than a pea. It's like just a little dot, basically, is what they told me, as well as kidney function issues. So I was always dealing with that trauma, which is ultimately why I wanted to get into pharmaceuticals, is to come up with a cure, right? I wanted to do that, and which is a noble thing to do, especially when you're indoctrinated in a way. Not that I like ever believed everything I was told. I was in that system for sure. So that's why I was at Rutgers, and then I ultimately ended up working. I'll just I guess finish the bio like real quick. Of I hopped over from Rutgers. I went to work at Pfizer as a scientist for over a year, directly on the COVID vaccine. And then I ultimately was offered a job by Project Veritas. And then I went over to O'Keefe Media Group. I worked at PV for a little under a year, I think, was the exact timing. And then I worked at O'Keefe Media Group for about 5 months. And then I ultimately resigned my position there due to reasons like the Bohemian Grove attending of James O'Keefe was just really too much for me to bear, and so I had to walk away from that situation. And then I produced my documentary testimony called Project Whistleblower, and it's at justintegrity.net. Um, I always like wonder if justintegrity.net was like the right thing to put this website on because I call the documentary Project Whistleblower, but I ultimately just subscribed to that because it's like a branching off of my name, and like I'm ultimately just standing in integrity. I'm not here to hide from anybody or the truth. um and I've ultimately have admitted where I have went wrong in the film too, but
Mhm.
ultimately standing in spiritual law and standing with God versus submitting to the system is really what I'm all about. So
Yeah.
we'll get into all that, but
Yeah. I hear that. So just take me back then. It's 2020. You're kind of finishing off. So when did you finish your master's degree? Was that 21 or
so
22?
I actually didn't finish it.
You didn't. Okay, you
No, I ultimately I did uh, a whole semester's worth of courses on a master's of biomedical sciences, and so at this point it was, I think I was enrolled in August
hmm
of 2020, right?
Yeah.
Or no, is that August? Yeah, it's August, right? I'm going.
I think I've got August down. I think it kind of spanned August 2020 to August 23, like the whole, like,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
just such a long story
yeah,
sometimes with dates and everything.
yeah.
But yes, August of 2020 should have been when I started my master's program. And then I did a whole semester's worth of courses. I was learning about like microbiology. I was learning about, you know, everything. Like I was learning about viruses and everything else, which I mean, we can get into that conversation because I don't even believe in, or I've I subscribe to saying that viruses haven't been proven to exist, which we can ultimately get into as well. But I was just full bore on Zoom University, like doing like 19, 20 something credits, I think, online. I was absolutely miserable. I was living at home with my mom, and like we would just get into fights all the time because of how miserable I was, and I just didn't feel like I was in the right space. So I was looking for an out, I suppose,
Yeah.
and that ultimately was transitioning to finding a job in the
Yeah.
pharmaceutical industry. So that's
So
where Pfizer came into play.
yeah, and so in terms of like you're obviously awakening at this point to like a lot of the lies because obviously that fast tracked a lot of people to start to open their eyes to a lot of the things were maybe not, well, they weren't genuine, and the whole COVID scam, as it were. So like how did you reconcile with like that knowledge of like this is a huge scam and now I'm going to go and put myself in this role? Like, how did you like tell me like what was the motivation behind that? Like, go into that a little bit if you could.
I mean, it just felt like the right thing to do at the time. Just brutally honest, like that's what I felt called to do.
Yeah,
It was a matter of, not being a full-time student at Rutgers anymore. I literally just said, all right, I'm just gonna do one class and
yeah,
just keep going, chugging along with the masters in case I don't get hired anywhere, because that was also an option that I didn't get a position somewhere. So I applied to four pharmaceutical companies, I think. Some of them were local, some of them were, up north in Boston and New Hampshire areas. And Pfizer was the only one to offer me a job, and I like reverse manifested kind of the whole situation. Like
I'd say so.
before I even was applying to these jobs, I like got into a fight with my mom, and I was like, I'm never gonna work for Pfizer, Moderna, or Johnson and Johnson. I said that. I said never gonna work for them. And then they were the only ones to come knocking at my door. And it was through a contract agency called Mindlands Inc. So I
Yeah,
wasn't technically like a Pfizer colleague, but I was employed to work there.
work there. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's kind of crazy. It's almost like, you're feeling so strongly about it all, and then it's kind of manifest for you to like then, yeah, it's like a part of your path almost. You can't deny
Well,
you felt
I
that.
woke up watching Plandemic 2,
Yeah,
which is a documentary done by Mickey Willis, and I actually met one of the journalists who was heavily involved, Danny Katz. She interviewed me about the whole my story. She watched my documentary. I met her in person actually at this confluence in music and sky events,
Hmm.
and I think Danny's very much legitimate from just who she is as a person. She's ultimately trying to get away from like the rabbit holes and everything else because that's just like a lot of black pilling happens with, you know, stories like mine. You're just like, wow, like this is crazy, you know. And so she was heavily involved in Pandemic too, and it helped me kind of kick me in the right direction of,
Yeah,
call it waking up, even though, awakening, whatever you want to term it, or just seeing through the veil, essentially. So
exactly. Yeah, exactly that.
that was during my master's program, and it was definitely a huge reason as to just me not even wanting to be in the master's anymore. I was like, this is insane. Like, what am I going to do? Spend more money on a master's and cement myself in the pharmaceutical industry forever. Just it didn't feel right. So I ended up, like I said, doing 4 job interviews, and Pfizer was the only one to come knocking after 2 phone calls, basically, and they just offered me a job, and I was like, okay. Um, I don't even know what I want to do at the time of the offer. I got called by the contracting agency and they gave me 24 hours to accept. And it took me 23 hours to accept because I was, we were talking about this offline. It's like one of those two roads diverge into a meadow, in a meadow wood or whatever by Robert
Yeah.
Frost. I don't even remember the exact quote, but it's 2 roads, and I decided to accept because I just felt strongly about my knowledge towards the situation and inserting myself for humanity, essentially, to, at least not stay on the sidelines. I had no idea what was going to come to fruition from the whole situation at all. No idea. This was never my intention ultimately to expose James O'Keefe for going to Bohemian Grove at the end of all of this. It just happened that way.
Yeah.
It's what it all evolved into, you know. So, but we'll
Yeah.
get into all
Yeah.
that. But I ended up taking the job at Pfizer as a formulation and analytical scientist, and I was working directly on the COVID shots every day, like the little vials. I was working on them, doing assays, analytical assays on a small scale manufacturing team. So there was a small scale fabrication team essentially that would do research formulations of this poison ultimately and hand it off to me, and I would do analytical testing through like fluorescence assays and like HPLC and appearance testing, just like looking at the thing, and fragment analysis of RNA percent integrity of like the RNA, supposedly like how much intact it actually is.
Mhm.
So that's what my role was working at Pfizer, is just like a small scale scientist for an analytical team.
And so, in terms of like when you were going in there, how long was it before you actually got involved with Project Veritas and started to actually record stuff? I mean, was that quite soon?
No, not right away. I reached out to them actually before taking the job. I
Hmm.
reached out to them in late February saying, "Hey, I'm so and so, I'm Justin. I have this job opportunity and I haven't taken it yet. What do you think if I take the job and, become a whistleblower with you guys? Like what is that cool?" And they said, "Justin, we can't tell you what to do, but if you
Hmm.
find something that's newsworthy, please
That's
reach
right.
out to us."
Yeah.
So it was interesting. I had the intention of not staying on the sidelines, and I didn't really know who else to trust either in the alternative media world. Like you look at James O'Keefe Project Veritas, they were out there, exposing election integrity stuff and
Yeah.
exposing stuff going on potentially with COVID and everything else, But ultimately it's all service level stuff,
Yeah,
So, and I was
exactly.
looking to go way deeper than that. So it's very interesting how I got sucked into reaching out to them and nobody else. I kind of like was tunnel vision about the whole thing, but I didn't know who to reach out to. I was kind of, I guess, dead set on Project Veritas because of the undercover stuff and because of how clickbaity and everything else their material was that was coming out, that I felt that they were the only ones that were trustworthy to work with.
Excuse me.
Oh, you're good.
Yeah, I mean, at that time, they were really the only ones who were doing it at that level, I guess. Like, there wasn't really anyone doing exposés that were getting a lot of, traction. So I guess it makes sense why you'd go to them.
Yeah, I mean, in hindsight, I wish I reached out to all the people that I'm friendly with now,
Mm,
like my friend Amanda Vollmer or Alex Zach of The Way Forward or Mike Winner of Alpha Vedic and Dr. Bear Lando of Alpha Vedic. I would have, if I could do it all over again, I would have reached out to them first because I see them as way more trustworthy in this space. And I had no idea who they were at the time, though. Like, I just had to go through so much learning as well, and
it's
just
learning,
figuring
isn't
out who people
it?
are, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there has been a lot of that. Yeah, as I say, like a lot of people who were quite awake fairly early on, they were looking to people who were probably not the most trusted sources,
Right.
but learning and
To
that,
answer your question, though, I ultimately reached out to them prior to taking the job, and then I didn't really reach out to them until Jody O'Malley's story came out,
yeah,
which,
the
or
nurse.
I reached out to them again, I think in August prior to Jody's story being released, and I talked to a journalist over the phone for a little bit, and the questions they asked were just kind of like they were dumb. Like it
Mm.
was like, do you know anything about Joe Biden being vaccinated? And I was like, what do you mean? Like, I work on the vaccine. I don't know who's getting injected with saline or not, if that's even happening. But, like, next question, basically. So it was just, that was a waste of my time initially. And then I ultimately reached out to them again from the Jody O'Malley story. And then there was a Johnson and Johnson story that they did. Johnson and Johnson and Pfizer like ultimately talked about how like, oh, I wouldn't recommend my kids to take this shot, and that's ultimately like I applaud that work of like getting them to say the thing, and ultimately wake people up supposedly, but they're not rooted in truth in the sense of they sucked me in to reach out to them after a story like that. Like James O'Keefe was out there in my documentary. You'll see it. He's like, if you work for one of these big pharma companies, reach out to us at Proton tip or Veritas Tips at protonmail.com or something. Right, that's their tip line. So
Yeah.
I did because they were exposing a lot from my perspective, and I felt I had to do something after the Jody story and after this Johnson and Johnson Pfizer dual story.
Mm.
So that's how it all started to play out. And I had a phone call with like four journalists, and they strapped me up with cameras and essentially started training me on how to elicit people from the inside. And then um, we get into like recording consent issues and things of that nature, which ultimately just blow up in my face because you know it just gets so big. We can go back and forth on that.
Yeah.
I
So
don't know how
in
you
terms
want
of
to dissect this.
when you started to do it though, did you get any kind of like fear of getting caught, or like did you have that underlying sort of, sense of I'm actually doing something that if I get caught, I could get into some trouble here? Like, was that going through your mind every day? Like you're talking about the high cortisol. Were you living in that realm of this is quite, quite dangerous stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, but I overlooked it too. I
Yeah.
was just like, I don't really care what happens to me at this point, is kind of what my mindset was. Like I was willing to go, like I had a group chat with Project Veritas journalists, and we called Pfizer the Viper Pit, like a
Mm,
snake pit, basically. And I was going in every day, pretty much strapped up like a spy. Like that's what they trained me to do.
mm,
They taught me how to do it all, like showing up with button cameras and phone cameras, like this.
mm. It's crazy.
They showed me how to do it all, and not once did they mention the recording consent laws that come into play. Like, why would you even give me the equipment without telling me that?
But you
That's
had the Yeah. So you had to sign something though, didn't you? Like a contract with them for the information that you'd be getting on their behalf. But
I
did,
signed a contributor agreement with them, yes, but I ultimately like I was 23 years old. I just went boom,
yeah,
sign, and didn't even look at it type
yeah,
stuff. I was way too trustworthy with them, and I maybe could have changed some things in the contract and the contributor agreement, but I didn't. I said I need to move forward with this group of people because they are going to be the people that ultimately help me just bring the truth to the world.
yeah.
And that's not how it played out.
No, no, but yeah, I mean, anybody at that age who goes into something like that, I think there's very few people that would be, analysing contracts and thinking about the legalities of it all. It's, you had the best intentions, which was to expose what was really going on, and that was for the benefit of everybody. It wasn't just for like a small group of people. The impact, and that's something that really blew my mind, was like knowing that you had that weight on your shoulders, that what you're bringing out to the world had such a potential impact that it would have ricocheted around the world, and it would have prevented a lot of people probably going down the route of getting the vaccine. It may have blown the whole thing up a lot sooner. I mean, it hasn't blown up yet, let's face it. We're still waiting for it to blow up, which is quite crazy when you think about it. But yeah, it's a
Well,
lot.
yeah, the reason my story hasn't blown up is because of how messy it got.
Yeah.
It
Oh,
got so messy.
yeah,
Like,
definitely.
I'm sure I was like, I ultimately think I was working with a lot of good people at Project Veritas. They didn't necessarily have bad intentions. It's just it got so messy. And then, I mean, the whole thing with like doing the recording is one thing. And then I went to the point of doing this carry a day like vial transfer thing too,
Yes.
which created a situation where Stu Peters and Carrie Madej did a show on October 20th of 2021, and she broke NDA with Veritas. Like she wasn't supposed to do that. And she ultimately did that, I think, because she didn't trust them. Like after everything happened, she just realized that something was wrong about the whole situation. The way that they were treating me, I suppose, and even. So she went on Stu Peters and ultimately talked about how there was a Pfizer whistleblower, Pfizer scientist working directly with Veritas.
Yeah.
And they basically said, stay tuned for this huge bombshell story. So that was October 20th. And then a few weeks later, there was an FBI raid of PV, of
Hmm.
Project Veritas, 2 days from each other. November 4th is when Eric Cochran and Spencer Meads were raided
Hmm.
by the FBI. And then James O'Keefe was raided on November 6th. And so that ultimately felt like extremely weird timing for the FBI to ultimately raid PV about Ashley Biden's diary
Hmm.
being investigated or stolen or something. And they didn't even have it. They gave it away to authorities. They gave it away to the police, I think, at a local level. Ultimately to try and return it to her, I think. And they investigated that story over a year prior, like in October of 2020, is when I was told they investigated it, and they didn't release that story because I think you could have found it on the internet anyways.
Yeah.
Um, it's just
So
people
yeah,
aren't.
there was a lot of suspicious, like,
Well,
things
yeah, it's just
around that time.
it was a story they investigated a year prior, and then I did all this crazy, gutsy, like almost insane stuff of like trying to just bring truth to the world, and then there's this FBI raid that occurs on three journalists, one of them being the CEO of the company, and they are saying that has to do with Ashley Biden's diary publicly when you do FOIA requests that ultimately talk about how the FBI raid could have been linked to Pfizer
Hmm.
either employees or representatives of Pfizer. And so I was their source. I was a representative of Pfizer.
Mm.
So that FOIA request could have essentially been linked to me for sure. So is it possible that Project Veritas had all this information, right? That I was just giving them freely. I
Hmm.
wasn't charging them anything. And they who knows? Do they go to Pfizer and give a phone call and say, "Hey, by the way, we have this kid and he is gonna blow the lid off of what you're doing unless you you pay us or we work together and basically figure out a way to shut him up.
Mm.
And I don't know. That's just I'm not affirming that that's how everything
Yeah,
played
there's
out,
definitely a lot of
but
unanswered questions, isn't there? Let's face it.
yeah, I mean, if discovery were to happen on my story, it would ultimately lead to all these answers. You know,
Yeah.
who's a useful idiot and who is potentially intertwined in some form of intelligence or call it private military intelligence. I mean, Project Veritas, I was unaware of this until pretty much after the release of my documentary that they're linked to Blackwater, which is ultimately linked to private military intelligence through this guy Eric Prince, who is he used to like hire mercenaries and things like of that nature, and he is I think like ex-CIA. So um, I don't have all that information off of the top of my head, but I've looked into articles and things of that nature. Washington Post has done several articles about Blackwater and Project Veritas in the past, I think back in 2016. So the information was out there for me to find. It's just there's so much information in the world that it's you know all hard to really navigate, I suppose.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think, yeah, a lot of the stuff, you know, had you had all this information, you talk about these different junctures where you make a decision and you would have probably made a different decision. So maybe the information hasn't reached you on purpose. So, I do think there's a lot of divine intervention. And I think we get information when we're supposed to get it. So in terms of everything you gathered up, obviously that was then with Project Veritas, and you were trying to find out from the documentary who was it with, external legal. Do you know if it's still held, and do you think at some point in the future it may see the light of day?
From my understanding, Project Veritas is in possession of my terabyte drive of
Yeah.
the video footage, and then we were talking offline, and um, there's also like anywhere from 2 to 400 pages of confidential documents that are I thought were in possession of my old colleague Alicia Gamble,
Hmm.
who was also working at O'Keefe Media Group with me and went over to Louder with Crowder to work with Steven Crowder in their undercover operation that they have going on over there, the Mug Club. Um, but we were talking offline, and I'm comfortable talking about this. I mean, Brian Gamble, her husband, ultimately said through her yesterday that supposedly those documents are locked up in a PV safe. So we'll see. Honestly, like I can't wait to see what happens with all of this. This is an evolving thing right now,
Yeah.
because I didn't have a conversation with Brian or Nightingale. Nightingale is Alicia
Hmm.
because the whole thing just gets really messy once
Yeah.
you start looking into what was going on. So we'll get into that more, but um, yeah, I'm finishing my thought on that right there for this
Okay.
point.
So going back to, you talked about the vials that you lifted one from Pfizer, there was one from J&J, and there was one from Moderna. So you guys all went over to New York, did you? And were able to analyze them. So there was a couple of microscopes set up, and you were looking at the vials to see what was going on. I think one of the things that you mentioned was somebody had blood taken and they put a dropper of blood to see what the reaction would be with the vial content. Can you just go through what you saw and yeah, what played out when you were analyzing them?
I believe in the documentary, the word I used was nightmarish,
Hmm.
and that's excuse me, that's kind of what it felt like. But what I actually was witnessing was on the slide, there was blood cells, right? These circles, I think that they were red blood cells. They could have been white blood cells. I'm not sure, but they were on the slide, and they were just sitting there, right, when you drew the blood. So we drew blood, put it
Hmm.
on a slide. We were looking at it. We had a big monitor, kind of like the size of, a laptop, basically,
Yeah,
just sitting above the. If my microphone is the microscope, right,
yeah,
sitting above it, and ultimately we drew the blood, put it on the slide, and then we took the vaccine out. Carrie Madej took the vaccine from the vial from Pfizer
yeah.
and put it directly on the slide. And then it took like right away they started acting a little bit funny, the
Mm.
cells, like the way that they were moving. And then ultimately after about 20 and then like 40 seconds in, but 20 seconds in they started really like potentially coagulating and just like stopped flowing the way that they were. And then 40 seconds in, they were just like clumping together and just like
Yeah.
making weird shapes together. So I acknowledge in the doc that this is a phenomenon happening outside the human body. Take this with a grain of salt, essentially. But still, to obtain that information directly from vials that were manufactured from the vaccine manufacturer and see that it's coagulating blood immediately, we need to raise questions on how that all played out from my perspective. And Project Veritas's excuse and the people that I worked with excuse ultimately was that they were unprepared with the situation. We did this in an apartment complex building. We did this in a little apartment room, you know, and they had a table with two microscopes. Carrie Madej was there, and there was like 8 or 9 people there. And so 8 or 9 people are witness to what I'm saying right now. And yes, they were underprepared. It would have been great to get a lab or something, but this is the way it was presented to me. And so there's no going back on the way things played out, you
Yeah.
know?
Happy how
So
it.
like they could argue like were things sterile? Were things done with scientific integrity? I mean, we recorded the whole thing from start to finish. So, like, that's how it played out. So, regardless of whether we were in a lab or we were just doing this on a table in an apartment, I mean, the only thing that was missing was like a hood or something that you use in science labs, right? Like, that's what we ultimately would have needed for aseptic technique ultimately to play out. But we were in a time of like dire need for this type of information from my perspective, like, and the fact that like this came from me, this idea, it came from me, and then they ultimately helped it come to fruition. They ultimately could have done it a different way with me, but that's how it played out. They could have found some lab in Massachusetts so we weren't crossing state lines either, but they didn't.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's sure, I guess it's asking a lot of them to ultimately do that, but they could have been honest with me on, oh, like since we're doing this in an apartment building, we're just not even going to release it. Like it just, it all is just red flag after red flag piling
Yeah.
up on top of each other. So that was the vile thing. And then we had the FBI raid, but back to you, Danny. That's kind of
Yeah.
finishing my thoughts on that. And
So
did I
in terms,
answer your question?
yeah, no, you did. Yeah. So I mean, when I was listening to what you were saying, and I can remember at the time when that was all released. So I was horrified, like when they was telling people, what they were seeing, and there were slides that they were actually showing pictures and things of what they were finding in the vials. It was just, yeah, and I guess it made me question because obviously there's a lot of questions around the batches and whether or not there's consistency with batches. Because I found out the batch number that my dad, who had died from the Pfizer vaccine, he was in the second worst batch that they recorded in the UK. And so that got me thinking about these batches and whether or not they are all consistent, or are there some, really kind of benign batches where there are nothing in them? What's your thoughts on that? Do you think that's the case or?
I mean, I go back and forth on it,
Mm.
but ultimately, I think that's pretty much a good way to look at all of this is that each batch is different and
Yeah.
there's really no way to say what is what.
Mm.
It's all speculation at this point, like
Yeah, no one
until
really knows.
there's discovery on everything in
Yeah.
Pfizer and Moderna and J&J, like come clean on all of this and how ultimately all played out. We have to speculate, but the way that I look at it is yes, certain batches are way more harmful and dangerous than others. Where
Yeah.
some batches saline
Yeah.
potentially, where other batches harmful drug delivery systems that cause clots and cause damage in the body that are essentially just, I like to call these things toxic poison bombs because my hypothesis is that it's linked to these patents that are like this drug delivery system through telephoresis. Like that's what Carrie Madej actually was saying on Stu Peters' show. She was talking about telephoresis. It creates these like carbon nanotubes in the arteries and in the veins, so that they like kind of harden up, and
Hmm.
that's ultimately where I think the clotting comes from.
Hmm.
But I'm no expert. I'm ultimately just drawing conclusions based off of what I've heard other people talk about and hypothesize ultimately, and it's a lot because I mean, is there graphene oxide in some of these files? I certainly think it's possible. Um, individual there's I think 26 teams that have analyzed these under a microscope, and each of them have come to their own hypotheses. Like the work of Dr. Anna Mahalja, she has looked at these and says that there is for sure graphene oxide or graphene oxide like substances. Dr. Carrie Madej, the night that we looked at them, was saying that these are graphene or graphene like. Although, like I'm friendly with Adam Bigelson, who is um, the son of Harvey Bigelson, and he does work with holographic blood. And what Adam says is that everybody's wrong, and it's not necessarily like graphene itself isn't something necessarily to be afraid of because it's
Hmm.
in everything. If it's at such a high concentration in the vials, then sure. But
Yeah.
what the holographic blood, what they do is they look at the cells or what's in the blood, and they're actually there's the theory out there. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but they're called microzymas, which are like beings of life that are all inside of us, and it's like potentially linked to really what source and God ultimately is.
Hmm.
Um, but this is a bit of a rabbit hole I'm going down. But Adam basically says that everyone is wrong and that ultimately the the vials themselves are not containing like nano chips, basically like nano self-assembling like nano chips in your brain and stuff. You said that the human body is too complex and too smart to necessarily allow something like that to happen, and he ultimately acknowledges that yes, you're injecting yourself with poison, so something is going to be going on, like clots. Clotting happens to prevent poison from going in certain areas of the body. Like that's a simple physiological way to look at it. But you know, I I prefer not to really speculate. I just say that it's poison that should not be going inside of you.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think it gives a lot of people a lot more hope as well to think that, not every single vaccine was, as poisonous as others. I guess, I can understand that point of view.
What
Um,
I would say is essentially, you know, you have to acknowledge that you made a mistake and repent, like they say. When you make mistakes and you ultimately sin against God, like you took an injection for something that you were told, is gonna kill you. Like you're told that COVID is like this scary thing that's gonna kill you, gonna kill grandma, gonna kill your dad. It's gonna kill so and so. So you need to take an outside manufactured product in order to be perfect against this. And it just it really it's kind of crazy once you get into the rabbit hole of virology itself actually not being backed on science. It's backed on pseudoscientific nature. And I mean, I went down that rabbit hole, and there's no going back once you observe how fraudulent their so-called science really is. And
yeah, I
it's
agree.
really it's fraudulent because they don't follow the scientific method. Really at a basic level, they're not following the scientific method. And I've had even recently I've had conversation with ChatGPT about this.
Oh,
And
really?
what ChatGPT does is they regurgitate the mainstream narrative, and then once you challenge it and challenge it again and put it in a corner and say, "Stop lying to me," then it'll actually tell you the truth.
Yeah.
So I'll share I can share a summary that I had with ChatGPT so that the audience, since we're on the topic, so I don't stray away from it. But um, here, so I'll just run through it.
Yeah, go
And
for it.
basically, I said, here's a summary of I said, summarize this conversation that we had. And I gave it 6 points to talk about and then say true or false, right? Like, is this
Mhm.
true or is this false? So here we go. The scientific method requires an independent variable with proper controls. True. For virus studies, a true independent variable requires a purely isolated virus. True. No studies have achieved actual isolation, only filtered, unpurified samples. True. Without an independent variable, proper controls are impossible. True. Therefore, virology fails to meet basic scientific method requirements. True. 6. Thus, virology is pseudoscience. ChatGPT says true, and then its explanation. There were sentence explanations after all these, but for time and just
Mhm.
following purposes, I didn't read them. But the last one says, if virology does not meet the rigorous standards of the scientific method, it fits the definition of pseudoscience by relying on assumptions rather than empirical proof.
Mhm.
So there you go.
Yeah,
It's pretty much admitting that we have been lied to about what is making us sick. And
yes.
is COVID a blessing in disguise to all of us from what has happened? Ultimately, I subscribe to that, but I ultimately subscribe to what happened with COVID was also, it was evil showing
Mm.
and revealing itself.
Yeah, I think it's like divine in a way. Like obviously there's a lot of people that have been working for this to happen, but it's backfiring and it's backfiring at a rapid pace and that's gathering momentum. So I agree. Yeah, I mean there was a lot of losses through that period, but I think a lot of the time we don't necessarily learn until we're in a position where, there's some pain that's felt. That's humanity's, flaw, I guess. Um, from my perspective, I was already kind of awake to the scam. I mean, I could just see all these red flags and I couldn't understand why other people couldn't see them. I found that really hard to understand. So, my husband and I, my kids, we absolutely didn't want to have a vaccine. Not that we had never had vaccines in the past, but this was different. I could see that this was the end game, and I just said, no, we aren't playing that game. So I found that really hard to reconcile. And obviously, my parents wanted to take the vaccine, and all of our friends did. So it was a really lonely place to be. And then knowing and trying to explain to them, and then my dad shortly dying after, it was like hell on earth. And I thought, why me? Like I was so awake to all these things, and then I lose my dad. But I guess it's made me use my voice a lot more than I probably would have done. I probably would have sat by knowing, but not necessarily trying to
Sharing.
sharing. Yeah, and I think that's something it's important, and I just really wish more people would have been braver, and that's why I think your story really struck a chord with me because it really frustrated me that there were so many doctors, there were so many good people who did nothing and they continue to do nothing. And it's it's below cowardice because you're allowing people to continue like that, you're allowing the evils to continue by doing nothing. And they say, really evil things can happen when good people do nothing and stay silent. And it's just so important that people don't do that. If you know something's wrong, use your voice because together we're so much stronger. So
Well, you're speaking part of my truth right at me into existence too. I mean, that's where I ultimately feel like I could have essentially been wrong in the sense of I was outsourcing my voice to Project Veritas ultimately to get to their platform. But I could have just literally been outspoken from the beginning too. You know, I got sucked into the media, the platform, the whatever excuse, I ultimately have to be self-accountable and acknowledge that all of this happened because I was not just speaking out from the get-go, which I mean, it was such a delicate situation that I was in, to be a whistleblower at the age of 23. I felt called to do it that way. Reaching out to Project Veritas is what my soul and my divine experience was telling me to do at the time. But looking back, I wish that I could have done it another way. But I also wish Project Veritas could have done it another way with me. If they are be brave, do something is the motto of Project Veritas, right? That's literally what their motto is. They had what I was calling to James Willy Wonka's golden ticket of whistleblower stories, and they sucked it out from under me and played me like a fiddle, basically, and like without them, there is no undercover operation that plays out with my whistleblower story. But I mean, ultimately, if I never had an interaction with them, I ultimately could have just stepped out and been vocal about the whole thing. I didn't have a following. I didn't have this. I didn't have that. Like those were the excuses I guess in my head. Um, and so, I got sucked into reaching out to James O'Keefe and Veritas as a whistleblower, and I could play out all the different things in my head as to how it could have or should have played out. And it played out in just a really crazy way,
Mm.
you
Yeah, it
know.
certainly did. So just take me back very quickly because I want to just touch on the people that you were working with at the time who were working at Pfizer. Knowing all the things that you knew, you being aware acutely that these injections are toxic. You're going in there daily. I'm sure that you had some nice interactions and you probably had some lovely colleagues, but did any of them strike a chord with you as actually having a sense that there was something wrong, or were they completely unaware?
They were all unaware. And the people on my team, from my perspective, were not whistleblower material, if
No,
that's what you mean.
no.
I was the only one that was, or I felt like I was the only one that felt like something was wrong. But I also, since I was surrounded by these people who thought they were doing good, that was a part of me remaining silent too. I mean, I asked difficult questions when I was doing the undercover
Yeah,
stuff for sure,
yeah.
and my manager actually was like, Justin, something wrong? Like, do you need to tell me something? And I'm just like, well, Conwell, I'm concerned about what's going on. Like, people are dying. I elicited people dying in certain conversations, and like it ultimately shocks my colleagues in the video. They're like, "You mean what?" Like they're just blown away. Like the head popped off. So
But they're literally not, they've not come across any of this information. They're not aware that there are
no,
concerns of safety.
no, they think it's a conspiracy theory. They
Do
think
they?
it pretty
Okay.
much. They're
Yeah.
like that. The vaccine has never killed anybody, and I'm like, bro, what? Like this is a worldwide clinical trial.
Yeah.
People, all the rats died, or all the mice died in the clinical trials that they did. Um, are you serious? Like you just it's either being completely naive to safety and ethics, or like they were under a spell,
Yeah.
like that's ultimately what I think was playing out too. Like I don't have hatred in my heart for anybody that I worked with at Pfizer that was under a spell, essentially, because that's really what it was. Humanity was under a spell, and like a lot of people are coming out of it now, even that like did take the shot. Like they might be like, "Oh wow, like I took a vaccine that had no clinical data and, was killing all the animals." If they learn about that, like they have a lot to admit that they were wrong about too, or admit that they could have done something differently. They could have stood up for their own bodily autonomy, but they didn't. They folded
Mhm.
because of a job. They folded because the system made them fold, which is where I am very against the system, like I'm very, like we were talking offline, I'm an anarchist in a good way. Like I'm not like burn the system down. I'm just like we need to make a new one because this current one is trying to kill us.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's ultimately how I see it, and a lot of people are starting to see it now too. Like it's very much revealing itself, which
Completely.
that's
Yeah.
that's also why, like, not to get into politics or everything, but like that's I don't subscribe to the political sphere of everything, or the political realm. Like
Mm.
kind of two wings, same bird. Trump helped with Operation Warp Speed all
Indeed.
the way
Yeah.
up
Yeah.
until the election, and then he doesn't get elected, and then ultimately it gets right approved right as Biden gets into office, and then it's on Biden to push on to the masses and then take the blame, so that
Yeah.
Trump is
All
essentially
right.
out of the harm's way of the conservative MAGA crowd ultimately, because the way I look at it as like a bait and switch. Like they baited the public in putting Biden out there saying, "Oh, like this is the bad guy from the conservative realm," and everybody that was on the left is buying into, "Oh, like take the vaccine, get mandated. It's all the unvaccinated's fault."
Yeah.
So all the people on the left got sucked into it because Biden got put in. If Trump was out there pushing this shot, for them, they might not have taken it. And I ultimately don't think anyone on the right was going to take it if Trump was in office at the time.
Mm.
So he needed to leave. He needed to
Yeah.
leave ultimately for the whole thing to be as effective as possible. And
Yeah,
then
I
you
agree.
had Trump out on the sidelines basically saying, "Take the vaccine. I took it. I'm boosted, but I believe in your freedoms, But then came all these mandates from all these companies, and people were folding, people were folding, not fighting. And I get it. Like people had to put food on the table, and that's what the system was doing to us. It was putting people in a bind to really um, make a decision. Like, are you going to put food on the table and support your kids and family, or are you going to stand up for your bodily autonomy? And so the next time that this happens, because it's going to happen again, I don't know how soon, but they're
Mhm.
talking about bird flu nonsense again, right?
Yeah, that's right.
We can't fold this time. Like humanity folded on a large scale. If the
Huge.
true percentages that are being reported, like 80% of the world got the COVID shot, that means that we folded, and there was only 20% of the world that was really willing to stick up for their rights, which I mean that's a good percentage, but we need that in the 40s,
Huge. It needs
50s,
to be switched. It needs to be the
60s.
other way
It
around.
it needs to be flipped, exactly. It needs to be 80% say no this time.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. And I think next year will be, or this year now, we're in 2025, but I think this year is going to be interesting. It can't not be because I mean, it's all been done on the way I see it, it's all been done on purpose. You've got Bobby Kennedy coming in now, who I do think stands for a lot of good positive things. He's done a lot of good things in his time. So I have, I have hope that he will follow through on the things that he said he wants to do. And, Trump will allow him to look at these things. Let's see how it genuinely plays out. I don't know. I don't really trust politics as such, but
I don't either. It's I mean, Trump went on Joe Rogan's show and he was talking about the polio vaccine. Joe
yeah.
was actually talking, I think, poorly about the polio shot, and then Trump was like, "Oh, if RFK takes the polio vaccine off the market, like, I won't
Mm,
let him." So I just think I don't know. Like I got sucked into the whole QAnon conspiracy theory and ultimately like can see how people that like subscribe to being a Trump supporter think that things are ultimately like playing out for good and that
mm,
there's some sort of military operation that's playing out. And I leave heart space like 1% of that to actually come to fruition and be true. But I have a hard time really believing it in the
yeah.
sense that that's ultimately what a controlled opposition type narrative would play
Would
out
use,
to
yeah, it would use
allow
that. Yeah.
these things
Yeah.
just keep getting prolonged. Oh, like wait another 2 weeks, wait another 2 weeks, keep
Yeah. Oh,
waiting,
what's
just
going to
keep
happen?
waiting, do
Yeah.
absolutely nothing. Like
Nothing, which disempowers everybody. And I think that's the thing, like a lot of people who do follow that. I'm not saying I don't know one way or another. I don't know. But
I
what I do
don't either.
is it is a distraction. And I think ultimately people have given their power away to external entities, be it government, be it whoever it is, they always give their power away. And that's no different because if you're waiting for someone to come along and save you, you've basically just disempowered yourself. And if this 4 years has taught us anything, or 5 years, it's about actually regaining your own sovereignty and your own power and knowing that you are the person who's here to lead your own life. No one's doing it for you. Don't wait for your savior to come because they're not, no savior's coming to rescue you.
Be your
That's
own savior. Vote for yourself.
absolutely, yeah, going on you.
People in the freedom community that I resonate with, I mentioned I think earlier Alex Zek, Mike Winter. Alex Zek has this organization, The Way Forward. I really resonate with Alec. He had me on his podcast before I even publicly came out with my documentary. He had an interview with me in person. I connected with Alec, and he speaks all of this stuff and follows through on everything that he speaks publicly about in the sense
Yeah,
of taking back our authority and stop
yeah,
giving authority to the system. You know, stop
exactly.
bowing
Stop
down
feeding it.
to
Yeah,
the system, right? The system is so it's literally everywhere. It's like you
yeah,
got police officers, they
yeah.
pull you over for speeding. Did you harm anybody? No, but they're gonna give you a ticket anyways. It's all
Yeah,
part of this racket. And so
yeah,
we need to take back our authority and show, at a bottom level, a main level, the system, we are men and women, all divinely created by God, the creator, etc. So who comes up with these speed limits? Who comes up with that? And who comes up
exactly.
with vaccine mandates, right? Like it's the system forcing it on innocent men and women who are ultimately sentient beings that just are waking up in our flesh suits every day. That's the reality that that's the psyop of reality itself is that this isn't permanent, right? We're all divine.
Mhm.
And I don't know where we go after this. I don't know if it just is a constant loop,
I think it is. I think it
but
is in some sense, and I think, like a lot of the people who came down to play their parts now, they came with, they've got missions, and you're definitely one of those people. You've come with a very clear mission and you've carried that out. But it doesn't mean it's easy. People think, well, he knows what he's here to do. That still, you're still living the human experience. You still have all of those feelings of, having your trust, taken away from you and putting yourself on the line, the emotional side of it all. I do think it's a spiritual war, and that's something that they talk about what's going on with the vaccines and what have you, but ultimately that's what it comes down to. It is all spiritual. I believe that's what it is.
well, and back to your comment about trust and everything, I mean, relating it back to my story, it was just leading into like, okay, I was a Pfizer scientist working at Pfizer, right? And then I was working with this alternative media group that's out there talking about helping whistleblowers and helping humanity essentially be brave, do something is their mission. And their second motto, like they have 10 laws, and their second one is we don't break the law. So,
Mm.
if they're gonna use that as their mission statement, like they could have been forthcoming with everything that was happening with me, and then, you know, getting to ultimately moving from Pfizer to Project Veritas as a journalist and learning undercover journalism. I like learned their ways on, call it intelligence, call it elicitation techniques, call it undercover journalism. I learned how to like get good at obtaining information from people, and I was like already good at that at Pfizer, but really leaned into that and got trained how to do that at
Mhm.
uh, Project Veritas through this undercover journalism that I was doing. And like we were talking offline, how I was like living three different lives,
Yeah.
my life at home, my life at work, and my life just kind of by myself, and like how it was, like you were saying, there was so much weight on me. And I was
Mm.
like, I wanted to like be friends with these people, and I still do actually. Like I still like have heart space for my colleagues from Project Veritas and O'Keefe Media Group. Like I don't hate these people at all. I just they need to like I want them to understand like where the heck I'm coming from telling the story this way. And I'm not perfect. It's how it's played out, And so like the whole getting a job offer from James O'Keefe, while sitting at a table in Hartford with four other journalists and being offered a job versus being able to blow the whistle on crimes against humanity because of this FBI raid and because of the recording consent stuff that played out. I just I like wanted to scream,
Mm.
and that's where like my trust was just slowly dwindling in the
Yeah.
entire situation. They were telling me that my story was not going to go away in vain, and I was like, "You're right. I'm going to go get it back."
Yeah.
So that's actually how it played out. I ultimately resigned from Pfizer 4 months later, and I was like, if I could go back in time, I would have reprinted all the documents that I had given them. But I thought I was just going to be able to get them back because I had so much trust in these people. I was like, they're just going to give me my documents back. They still haven't gotten them back. I got like a couple pages back from the whole Jordan Walker story that I ended up doing. But
Yeah.
it goes to show that like these it like it's I'm losing a train of thought or like just maybe need some back and forth on this, but it's just it blows my mind how it played out, you know.
Mm. So let's just touch on then when you went and did the undercover piece with Jordan Walker, how did that all come about? How did you find him? Did you find him or did they find him?
Good question.
Mm.
I didn't actually find Jordan. I was given him through the dating app Bumble. Carrot
Mm-hmm.
Top, who I mentioned in my film, he was an intern at the time, and Carrot was also he was swiping on his phone. He was swiping on his burner phone, and he found Jordan Walker, who has Pfizer executive as his top, or not Pfizer executive. It was Pfizer director. He was a director of mRNA scientific planning, and
Mm-hmm.
so he matched with Jordan, and they were like they matched together, and he ultimately, I don't think he messaged much back and forth. He ultimately sent the match to me and
Mm-hmm.
said, "Oh, like he sent it to my burner profile basically, through my email or
Yeah.
phone number or whatever." And then I swiped on him and then we matched and then we connected right away and
Mm-hmm.
ultimately set up meetings slash, under
They.
in Jordan's perspective, it's a date. From
Yeah.
mine, we call it a meeting. It's a
Yeah.
meeting with a
Yeah.
subject, and that's all I had to do with that, except you have to play into the fact that it's a date from their perspective.
Yeah.
Don't
Exactly. You have to entertain
don't
it a little.
cross the line. Like I wasn't getting kissed by the guy, but like it got a little like it crossed the line in some ways for me throughout the whole process of like learning undercover journalism. Like my second date ever, this wasn't with Jordan Walker, but I got a little peck right on like the side of my mouth from this guy in the Bronx who was like he called himself a queer or whatever, and he was like a teacher who cross dressed and stuff sometimes. He would do both, like act as a man and then act as a female sometimes, and it was
Okay.
just like really weird. So that's part of my story is just going through that and getting traumatized the whole way up until this Jordan Walker story. And like at the time, I pierced my ear to come across as more feminine because
To
I
make
feel
it
like,
believable.
yeah, exactly. It's more believable when you have an earring. Not saying that guys who have earrings are gay. It's
No,
like
but you need to kind
I
of play a part, don't you? Like you're
for
showing up
sure.
as
Yeah.
a character.
Yeah, no, that's I had to lean into it. So, the Jordan Walker meetings, he told me Pfizer's mutating COVID 45 minutes into the meeting. Um, and
He
I
talked
was
about the
just
female menstruation issues as well, I think, didn't he?
He did, yes. So that was revealing, and I'm happy about that story, like the fertility aspect of everything and the menstruation issues and like taking Pfizer off my resume or whatever. Like that's great and all, but ultimately the Pfizer story that I did was blown out of proportion because it was called directed evolution. We're mutating COVID and this and that, right? We're making the virus that's already dangerous and we're making it more dangerous. Be afraid. You're going to need vaccines for this. Is ultimately that narrative is kind of
Yeah.
coming to fruition almost. And I'm like sitting in front of this guy, and we were just talking about my stance on virology. And I read off the scientific method on how virology is backed on pseudoscience. So I'm sitting there doing a job, but I'm also there like this is against my truth,
Mm,
like this isn't about viruses. This is about poison going into people under the guise of a psychological operation on the
yeah.
world. So my story, like it got 50 million views in like a week or so, or like a month, I think, on Twitter.
Yeah.
And at this point in time, Elon Musk was already back and they did a Twitter Spaces about my story on for Project Veritas, and it was just it felt so like I was just used. You know,
Mhm.
I was used, I was
Direct
used,
the
I was
narrative
used.
completely.
It
Yeah.
was not my truth. And they like James on the Twitter spaces goes, the man that got this story as the journalist worked for Pfizer. And then Kim.com is like this big influencer in the conservative space. And he's like, wow. Literally, like it's in the film. He's like, wow. And it's like Steve Kirsch and other like Steve Kirsch actually elicited that information out of James. He was like, how the heck has there not been a whistleblower? And then James literally said, well, basically the person that did this was like working on a story like this for a long period of time. So I think James is ultimately trying to give me some kudos there, but it's all just these bits and pieces that
Yeah.
I ultimately accumulated to come forward, and maybe, it's just like I can see why they did certain things, with like the legal aspect of everything, but like when you get into God's law and like ultimately just saving lives and sharing truth, I was part of a propaganda machine,
Yeah.
is how I look at it.
Yeah. So do you want to talk a little bit more about that? So just on the Jordan Walker piece though, when I watched it, my first initial, so I didn't actually put two and two together. I didn't realize that was you who done that piece until I
No
watched
one did until I came
it.
forward,
Yeah. So I'd seen that, but my instinct was something's amiss here. Something's off.
really.
It felt to me like he was an actor. And I know he was probably a little bit more flamboyant, but it just felt very forced. And I can't even explain it, but I had other people say the same thing to me. It was like he didn't feel legit. Like, and that's why I said to you, how did you find him? Have you come across that before? Has anyone said that to you?
Yeah, I still question him.
Yeah.
I don't have the answer if he's
No.
actually a legitimate Pfizer employee colleague or not. But I mean, on his LinkedIn, there's a LinkedIn with this guy,
Yeah.
supposedly, and
Mhm.
like there's pictures of him at med school, but he also
Okay.
was a med school dropout. I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't
No.
know the answer. Like we're gonna find out one day, maybe in this
Monday, yeah,
life
for
or
sure.
the next. But
Yeah, for
you
sure.
know, the whole thing, yeah, I totally would agree that he could have been an actor because
Yeah.
the what he was saying to me just it's it was the perfect lines of like, oh yeah, like we don't tell that to the public, right? Like that's
Yeah, I
what
mean,
he was
that's
like. And
what I
I was
mean.
just
I was
like,
like, oh, yeah, something don't sit right
but
with this.
there's also such an innocence about this undercover journalism thing too, in the sense of like just eliciting information out of people. You can get people to say these types of things. Like I was good, I was just sitting there with my hands out, like smiling,
Yeah,
didn't talk anything about work, and then he starts getting into it, and then I asked the right question, like, is Pfizer mutating COVID? And he's like, well, we don't say that to the public. No, but like ultimately we had this meeting and then there's this monkey cell stuff, and then I'm sitting there like my head is blowing off and I'm just like, is this guy an actor? Is this
yeah.
legit? Like,
But you
uh,
prepped yourself in terms of where you were going to take it. Had you discussed with the guys like we're going to go this way with this,
I
or had
didn't I didn't know it was gonna get into Pfizer mutating COVID and like a gain of function story that is all
yeah,
fake. I had no idea. I wanted to get more on vaccine injuries and
yeah,
deaths, but it leaned into this mutating
sure,
of the virus story that is just how it played out,
mm,
and it's crazy because like I try to hold myself accountable in the sense that like I was doing a job,
yeah,
and there was to say like to get this guy to talk about that like there is no virus, like he believes in viruses, there's no way he's gonna be like, yeah, the virus doesn't exist, so
yeah,
like that is also just part of the duality of everything. So the story itself ultimately exposes a lot of big pharma corruption in the sense it's like surface level, but also is a propaganda machine because it got 50 million views across the world basically.
mm,
And like there were videos that were coming out with like people from Japan and people from Russia, I think, and all these countries like taking the James O'Keefe SI video SI means surprise interview, of where he goes and confronts Jordan Walker about mutating the virus, basically. And he freaked out in this pizza place. And like what's symbolic about the pizza place too is that it was at Ignacio's in Brooklyn, in
Mhm.
Dumbo, Brooklyn. So like I had a friend who I met after the fact, who thought the whole thing was a sham too. Like it just felt weird.
Mm.
Um, his name is Jacob Israel on Twitter. He did a little dissection of just how everything aligned with my story and like how it played out with Jordan Walker. Ignacio's is, you could take Ignacio's and link it to Ignatius of Loyola, who is the founder of the Jesuit order.
Mm.
Who the Jesuits, people conspire that they are essentially part of one of the hidden hands, if not the hidden hand, of how everything is played out in this world right now, and that they're pushing these narratives on people through control systems like the CIA or like the
Yeah.
FBI or like the United Nations. Like these world governments are just all intertwined with Jesuits, but I also think it's not to me it doesn't feel like it's just the Jesuits. It feels like it's the Jesuits. Call it Zionism, call it the 13 family bloodlines, call it just the United Nations in general and their hidden agendas. Like there's so much going on in the collective human consciousness that is corrupted, and it ultimately leads to the top, like the hidden triangle on the dollar bill, basically, of that eyeball. Like who is the all-seeing eye? I don't know,
Mhm.
but there's a huge pyramid that ultimately leads up to it. So I'm going on a little ramble here, but it's
Yeah,
just
no, it's all interesting stuff though. So just going back to the germ theory and obviously viruses. Um, so what do you think then? What was making people sick? Because people were getting sick. Like there's no denying that. I mean, I got sick. I lost my sense of taste, smell. I wasn't afraid of, because I know there's the fear element that can actually induce sickness. Something was making people sick. What are your theories around that then?
I subscribe to that it was really a fear-based propaganda campaign,
Okay.
which like when you have the news and everybody watching the news and getting locked down, like stay inside, don't go outside, don't get sunlight, you know, be afraid, wear a mask. Like everything that they were telling people to do was contributing to sickness, right?
Mhm.
Getting ill. And when you subscribe to terrain versus germ and you remove the germ out of everything, you can see it more clearly, actually, as to why people were dying. Like when you are pushing onto people, take a test, you're gonna, you might kill grandma, you might this, you might that. Like it's this virus, it's the invisible enemy. Like be afraid, be afraid, be afraid. That heightens your anxiety. It heightens your so-called cortisol levels, right? Like I'm questioning the hormones themselves at this point in time, but there's something there with that, and I don't want that to stray my thought, but it's everything else. It's the
It's the environment.
pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
It's your environment. That's what the terrain is. It's wearing a mask 24/7
Yeah,
or
inhaling the recycled air and crap.
yeah, like you're not breathing correctly. Your lungs are essentially not collapsing, but they're not getting the maximum, so-called oxygen input and output, and you're ultimately just inhibiting a natural bodily process. So that's just one domino that feeds into everything else, like antibiotics that you're taking. Is anyone taking antibiotics that was dying? Is anyone if you take the test and you tested positive and you went to go to the hospital because you didn't want to get anybody else sick, if you tested positive, you're going to the COVID floor or
Hmm.
whatever, and then they were putting you on a ventilator some or most of the time, whether you're asymptomatic or not. They're putting people on remdesivir. They're
Yeah.
putting people on, I mean, the hydroxychloroquine, the ivermectin. I don't subscribe to those drugs being safe or effective either. Those are pharmaceutical drugs that ultimately, I know ivermectin is linked to infertility. There's studies written about that
Yeah,
in
I've heard about that.
animals.
Yeah, I've heard about
So
that. Yeah, it's
Um,
an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I don't know if you followed or seen anything that Dr. Brian Ardis has talked about. So he talks about the snake poison. So I've never come across this before, and the only reason I'm talking about it is I went to an event in London and he was talking at it. I didn't even know who was at the time, and I don't know how I've got to this point and I didn't know who was, but ultimately I didn't. So then I started to look at what he was saying, very open-minded just to hear what he had to say. So what he talks about is snake venom actually creates like a lot of the symptoms that people were suffering from. So it suppresses your diaphragm, so you're not breathing properly. It can coagulate the blood. It can stop the smell, the receptors of smell and taste. So the actual things that venom does in the body, it kind of replicates what a lot of the things that people were saying they were receiving from COVID or, you know. So yeah, I don't know. I don't
it's
know.
possible.
Mm.
I like, was it in the vials? Maybe, maybe not. I really don't know. I ultimately subscribe to the vaccines are poison, regardless, whether it's snake venom, whether it's manufactured chemicals of heavy metals, etc. Like, don't put that in your body. And then what was COVID? Ultimately, there was a coordinated attack with 5G towers being put up everywhere. They really picked up I think they picked up spraying looking
Yeah, they
back. I
did.
mean, just
I
over time they've picked up spraying with chemtrails
They've just done it
and
recently in Europe. I don't know what it's like in the States, but we've had 2 weeks where it's been the skies, you couldn't see the sun. It was complete coverage, and everyone I know has got sick. And
well,
I don't really get unwell as such, but I have definitely felt like there's something on my chest like I'm trying to bring up all the time. Um, yeah, the spraying is definitely a thing, and I never really thought it was until recently. I've just realized that we just aren't seeing the sun. So where has the sun gone?
well, it's a really important and difficult conversation to have with people who believe in the virus too, because
Yeah.
they are using logical fallacies in the sense of oh, like I got sick. It must have been a virus, and it's like, well, once you look into the evidence of virology and its existence, it doesn't make any sense. And it's ultimately, you gotta look at everything else. Like we're saying, it's the environment that you're being put in. I mean, fear based propaganda is way more deadly than it is safe, that's for sure. And with CNN death tickers going up every single day, oh, a million people have died from COVID or whatever,
Yeah.
that is
Has an
not
impact,
safe. Like
sure.
that is causing a ripple effect on the world.
Yeah.
And when you're told you're gonna get sick and you're gonna die, a lot of
It's the
people buy into
psyche,
it and
isn't it?
believe
No,
it.
it's the
It's
psyche
programming.
thing.
It's literally
Yeah.
programming. It's
Yeah.
it's it's a manipulation of our consciousness at
Yeah, it
an
really is.
individual level, but it becomes the collective.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's this is it. And I think that where you've got to is obviously you have to go down a lot of these rabbit holes to get to the point of understanding things to a certain level because there's not a lot of people who are willing to have that conversation. You know, they will just not accept that that can be a truth. But I think surely we've come this far, we've got to accept that there's a lot of things that we were thinking could be true and now realizing actually they absolutely aren't. So I think you have to be very open to that. But I do believe in, yeah, terrain theory for sure, because it's, you know, we're made whole and perfect, and it's only when you level on toxins and our environment that things change, and people get sick, and then they blame something else for it. So
Yeah, it's outsourcing your own autonomy. It's like, oh, I need an ibuprofen because I have a headache. That's
yeah,
how I'm gonna get better. Like, no, that's actually not.
no,
It,
exactly.
it, I mean, you'll feel better in the short term because that's how these chemicals, ultimately these pharmaceuticals work, is they cause your system itself to like hyper react and like work better for a certain period of time in the sense of like, oh, like this is poison, like we need to react in a certain way, and you feel better for a little bit, but ultimately it's playing an impact on like liver toxicity and
Yeah.
and just overall function of homeostasis.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that. I've definitely done a lot more learning of late on that point, really. So what's next for you then? Tell me, like, what does the future look like? I talked to you about the other day. You are going to write a book. It just dropped in. I was like, he's got to write a book. I've got to tell him. You are going to write a book, aren't you? So are
I
you?
am. It's gonna take me a while, I think, to fully get something like that out. Just because, I mean, from the release of my documentary, I did like 40 podcasts in like 8 months or less. So I was full board, just like doing my own media blitz basically, because I'm just one guy and I know the importance of my story. So I was just going on everyone's show that I could, whether they subscribe to germ theory, terrain theory, or don't know about what the heck anything is, whether they just heard I'm a Pfizer whistleblower. They're like, oh, let's talk to Justin. So I was hopping on all these shows. Like I said, I did about 40 in like 8 months, and
Wow.
that ultimately exhausted the what out of me.
Mhm.
And so I've taken a step back in the sense of like doing them as consistently as I was, and ultimately I was faced with a, like you're saying, what's next? And um I was saying I don't necessarily know on a lot of these podcasts in the sense of, do I become the next James O'Keefe investigative journalist operation? That's possible, but is that also what my heart desires? I'm not sure. And so one day it came into my field of like going to become a chiropractor potentially, as I've seen healing come from chiropractic myself in my own life. I believe in holistic healing. So I've actually branched into going to school to become a chiropractor right now. I don't
Yeah.
know if I brought that up to you
No, that's
privately, but
amazing.
so that is what I am doing, and it I'm kind of in two paradigms right now, believe it or not, Danny, because the whole thing is like we're talking about germ versus terrain, and the whole
Mhm.
thing, chiropractic is rooted in germ, and so like I'm blessed actually that I was in that master's program because I'm not taking microbiology, which is the
Oh, that's good.
viruses,
Yeah.
bacteria, and fungi class.
Mhm.
I don't have to take it at all because of how rooted my master's program was in it. But
Brilliant.
I'm stuck in that paradigm still, in the sense of I'm around people who are like taking the microbiology course, and some of them are believing it, believe it or
Mhm.
not, and then there are others who I've connected with that know what I'm talking about. They know that terrain is actually the truth, and they know that this is ultimately all, call it BS, is what they're
Yeah.
learning. They know it, and they that's where like the conversation about authority and everything else is so important. It's like we're gonna let them dictate what we have to actually learn and spend money on through courses and things of that nature. Like it's pretty mind blowing to have gone through just a quarter of what I've gone through, and to say that I have 13 more of these things that are ultimately rooted in the wrong paradigm. So
Mhm.
since I'm in two paradigms, like one in my mind and then the physical is a little bit different than where I'm at, I'm ultimately looking to alchemize this situation still. Like this conversation I had with ChatGPT was part of my philosophy class. And I had this conversation with ChatGPT. It wasn't rooted in chiropractic philosophy, but I ultimately took this conversation and put it into a paper rooted
Mhm.
in vitalism. And to me, what vitalism and what I've learned about is it's the divine innate intelligence inside all of us. Like we're all created from the same source, essentially. We all come from that innate intelligence that stems from universal intelligence. Universal intelligence is essentially what creates the universe, right?
Yeah.
It's what has created this realm essentially, and it's what's behind that. Is it consciousness? Is it I'm still looking to fulfill and kind of write out my own philosophy about it all, but I was I essentially was talking about how we're all divine sparks, and we have actually been lied to about natural science itself. Is really what my philosophy paper was about this quarter, and I used this conversation with ChatGPT ultimately to steer that conversation in that direction, and I cited the whole thing, and I looked into cell biology too. Like I looked into the nature of like the cell and if we've been lied to about that because I felt like we just have a firm misunderstanding of it. And
Mm.
I would have been homies with this guy, but his name's Harold Hillman, where he is a neurobiologist. He won a Nobel Prize. He um, neurobiologist, and he was also we'll just stick with neurobiologist. But he was like pretty famous in the alternative health space. But
Yeah.
his work is going to live on forever. And in his final paper, he basically talks about how there is little to no evidence of this model that is presented about the cell in the sense of like Golgi bodies existing, endoplasmic reticulums, lysosomes, etc., etc. He says the real basis of the cell at a micro or even nano level is whatever they're calling the nucleus exists from his understanding as well as mitochondria. Those
Okay.
two things seem to be true, where everything else seems to kind of be lied about because ultimately what scientists do is they take these so-called, they take dead cells and then they apply
Yeah.
outside things to it, whether it's drugs or just serum or whatever, and it causes things to happen on the slide, which are phenomenons happening outside the body, and that is not happening in the living cell. So I looked into
Interesting.
his work, and I think it's pretty mind-blowing stuff, honestly. So, yeah, I'm obviously I go down rabbit holes, and I
That's
don't
good
really.
though. It's how we learn though, isn't it, really? And then you've got that ability to then share that information. So I think this is what it's going to take to shift the paradigm is actually getting people to have that ability to go wider and not accept what is shown to them as truth. And when you have an inkling and you go there, I think that's really powerful. And that's how you
Yeah.
open up other people's minds. So
It's like I'm not even doing this program, like call it program. It's a program.
yeah.
Like, but it won't affect me because I can just see through it all. I can see through their veil. I'm not doing it to be a doctor. I'm
Mm.
not here to call myself Dr. Justin or Dr. Leslie. I'm not
Yeah.
that I could care less about that. It's more about I want to learn like the hands-on nature of like chiropractic healing. I
Yeah.
want to learn that. I want to incorporate the mixing aspect of a lot of it and incorporate homeopathy, learn about
Yeah.
naturopathy, learn about all these things while I can. And
Mhm.
then we'll see what happens when it comes to taking boards, when it comes to getting a license and
Yeah.
intertwining myself in the system.
Mm.
Ultimately, like I was saying, like the system is so compromised and corrupt that like we need to help build a new one.
Yeah, I
So
agree. I agree.
I want to learn and then create kind
The
of
new.
the new,
Yeah.
and ultimately if I can not sacrifice, but if I can obtain enough truth and enough information and cipher out the good from the bad and then help create and learn how to like teach chiropractor. I don't even know if I'm gonna call it chiropractic, but it's like hands-on healing,
Yeah.
learning hands-on healing.
You get the under you if you learn the basics from that and then you can actually work in the way that you want to. I actually know somebody who's created their own version of like chiropractic. It's a really good modality for healing. I've taken my son, I've been as well. Yeah, it's really I think I need to think of what he calls it, but it's amazing. It's really good and he's helped loads of people with that and he's trained up loads of other people. So yeah, there's different ways of going about it, isn't there? I mean, you're obviously going down that traditional route, but it doesn't mean it has to end there, does it really? It's just that's where you're heading now. But
It's I'm rooted in one paradigm ultimately to like alchemize and change the paradigm, or help create something new that I think is necessary. We'll see how long it lasts in it though. Like we'll see how crazy things get.
yeah, well, this is it.
And then,
Yeah, it'd be an interesting journey. I mean, I guess your journey's not really over in terms of the work you've done the prior 5 years. I think that hasn't gone full circle yet for you, it hasn't closed out. So yeah,
well,
you've
and there is also, um, I still plan on doing some form of investigative journalism still, not like the undercover stuff. I don't really have a desire to do that at least the way that I was. Like if I ever go undercover again, it's not gonna be like as a gay guy, you know?
Fair enough. Done
I
that.
could see myself going in that direction, but that's possible. But ultimately, like there are other people like me in the alternative media world who have reached out to, these right-wing provocateurs and had their stories not told. So I feel like that I am somebody who can help share some of these stories. So I'm going to be doing that sort of on the side. It's just there's also, unfortunately we live in a financial system and I need to make
Yeah.
money for myself somehow. And there's not a lot of money in that area, at least right now. I haven't seen it. So I got to do something. I can't just sit on my butt. So that's where the whole chiropractic thing kind of with doing journalism on the side is. And, we'll see where it goes, you know?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Let's see. Well, I'm
thank you
interested.
so much for this
No,
conversation.
no, thank you so much. And like genuinely, thank you from my heart to yours, like for the genuine, courageous efforts that you went to and the things that you did in the name of humanity. I genuinely appreciate them. I think you're a very rare person. And I do stand by what I say in terms of integrity. There aren't very many people who have it, and you certainly do in bucket loads. So well done to you. And yeah, I look
Thank
forward
you,
to what
Danny.
comes next. I really do.
And I don't know if I said it, but for those who want to watch my documentary that have not seen it, it's at justintegrity.net. You can find it linked on that page. Danny, if you could put it
Yeah,
in
I'll
like a
share
show
it.
notes or something, and just share my website and they should be able to
Will
find it, or just
definitely.
look me up and type in Project Whistleblower as
Yes.
well, and you should be able to find it. And
Yeah, it's a
bing, bang,
must watch.
boom.
Yeah, anyone who hasn't seen it has to watch it. It's brilliant. It really is. It tells the whole story perfectly. And then I think whatever comes next, we'll stand by and we'll wait and watch because I'm sure it's not over. So yeah.
Yeah, I will. I mean, last thing I'll say is I'm participating in this thing called it's humanitysuit.com, and I'm working with my friend Shelby Hosanna from Unjected,
Oh
which
yeah.
is the dating app. And she is helping to spearhead a crimes against humanity lawsuit, and we're doing it all pro se. And
Amazing.
it will be pretty crazy to see if it ultimately comes to fruition.
Yeah. I've been
There
following that.
will
So
there will be
awesome.
updates on that. I hope that it does come to fruition because it would be amazing for justice to be served, and I'll be able to provide a testimony for the vaccine injured and killed. And ultimately, we'll look to slip in some stuff on virology being completely, uh, you know, backed
Yeah,
on nothing. So, like that's something that the world needs to know and learn and hear. So,
definitely.
um, that's
Amazing.
we'll see where it all comes to fruition. So,
Well, I'm sure it
thanks
will. So
again,
yeah, that's
Danny.
amazing. No, thank you so much. And yeah, I will be in contact when this goes out. And yeah, I'll add all the links. So thank you, Justin. Appreciate you. Thank
Awesome.
you so
Much
much.
love.
Take care.